I'd like to thank all the panelists for coming. I found all of the topics incredibly interesting. I have a question for Mr. Gardner. You talked a little bit about conflict of interest and the challenges faced by museum professionals themselves. I wanted to ask, in the idea of setting standards, the idea of how we don't need new standards, we just need to abide by the ones that we already have. At what point does the responsibility of the organization, whether it be AAM or any other of the professional organizations, end and the responsibility of the individual professional begin? Because I know personally as a private conservator, I deal with issues like this all the time where I have to make a decision as to whether or not to devote resources to, say, something that I know to be a counterfeit or that I know to be a forgery away from genuine pieces. And I just was wondering, what's the general opinion regarding personal standards?
Yeah. Well, first of all, in terms of the professional standards, AAM, ICOM, ASLH, all of those standards, none of them are enforced. There really isn't a mechanism for that, and they basically depend on self enforcement. So there isn't a mechanism to make that happen. There have been organizations in different disciplines that over the years have taken on enforcement. When I was at the American Historical Association, we indeed had complaint process and reviews and responses so that individuals could bring these issues to the fore. Because your example of being an independent conservator, one of the issues is when you're talking about ethic in an institution, it's a little easier to deal with. When you're talking about someone who's here and working for someone over here, what's the mechanism for bringing these issues out, and is it up to the individual to do or not? And professional society ethics enforcement is one of those vehicles for cross-institutional discussion. When it comes down to it, I don't think the professional codes are as important as the institutional codes and the ways in which the institutions really stick to their responsibilities. I think the institutional codes are where that's where the line is drawn, and if we don't have them, and the Smithsonian did not have an institutional code of ethics until January. So we're relatively new to this area because there had been so much focus on individual behavior. There wasn't any real focus. We really weren't looking at how it all connects together. So not sure that I answered that, but you can't really rely on the professional codes. I think it's more about the institutional codes. I think conservators are in a different role from most of the rest of us in that you are operating in a tighter context for that. And maybe Malcolm.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I can add to that either, but
I guess an appropriate follow-up would be something like, are we over-dependent on organizations to set standards? Have we lost, has the individual on the ground, the person who actually is touching the artifacts on a day-to-day basis, have we become lax in our ability to set our own standards? Or are we relying on the organizations too much?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm not sure. I mean, if anything, I mean, the core, themes throughout all the ethical standards that I've read, I mean, they're all based on these sort of. It's almost like comparing it to religion, really. I mean, a lot of it is based on your individual ability to properly interpret what those standards are. And I think within AIC, the American Institutes for Conservation, you can be kicked out of the institution if you violate some of the ethical principles. I think it's very rare that happens.
Same thing with ANA and the other ones too.
Yeah, but I mean, you're primarily left up to your own devices.
The purpose of ethics is really not about individual behavior, but really about how we function as a profession, and that there's some consistency across our field, and that we do understand when we take actions individually that these are the actions appropriate to our profession, and that colleagues in other institutions would take similar approaches. I mean, it is about that sort of wider connection among us all, rather than about do I think this is a good idea or not? It's about, if I look at the profession, what's appropriate.
Thank you very much.
I'm Jason Hall with Public Trust Strategies and George Mason University, and for 16 years I was Director of Government and Media Relations for AAM. So I'd like to make a brief comment about enforcement of codes of ethics. There is a formal mechanism in one area where a museum is accredited. There can be a formal complaint made. That is investigated, and if it's sustained, then the museum can lose its accreditation. Museum of Northern Arizona, for example. There is also a de facto mechanism which actually works quite well, and that is that the AAM code and all of its related guidelines are visible on the website, and whenever the press is concerned about such matters, they come to AAM, and AAM points to the website, and there they are. That's all the equipment that the media needs to enforce the code in a de facto way. And I've seen many changes in museum activities as a result of that de facto enforcement. Just for the information of folks that are maybe not aware of this, AAM, of course, has had a code of ethics for a very long time, has revised it many times, and in recent years, that is in the last 20, 25 years, has developed a series of spin-off guidelines which are indeed interpretations of the general principles of the Code of Ethics. One of them indeed is in business support, another is in individual support, borrowed objects where you have donor influence, and Nazi loot, and there's another one in process about archaeological objects.
Emlyn Costa from Liberty Science Center. I wanted to, in this session, which is the part of the day focusing on collections as it relates to the codes of ethics, I want to just insert the important issue of, before we get to conserving and looking after and appropriately taking care of the item in the collection, it's where the collection should belong in the first place. And since there are a growing number of countries that are signed on to the Blue Shield, which is the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross, if you will, that we shall not use times of conflict to amass our collections anymore, which is the very process that amassed our collections in the past. I'd like to ask Malcolm about the situation of the bus on which Rosa Parks rode, and which was purchased by the Henry Ford Museum, and which has been denied the museum celebrating Rosa Parks' life as an iconic artifact. Where was the ethics in that decision?
The ethics in the decision of what?
To buy the Rosa Parks bus and install it in the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan, as opposed to ensure that it goes to the right place, celebrating her life and impact.
Yeah. That was actually brought up by several people at her funeral, by some of the people that had gone to
Not surprisingly.
viewing, yeah. And I mean, the response from the administrators there was, you know, it was sold on the open market. It was auctioned off on a live auction on the internet. And their opinion was, you know, if you want the bus, then you have to come up with the money to buy it. But you know, Rosa Parks spent the majority of her life in Detroit. That's where she died. The other great venue where it should have been at, or could have been displayed at, would be the African American Museum, which is in downtown Detroit. But I mean, their facility can't support that, you know, that size of an artifact. There's all sorts of other sort of, you know, links to Michigan. But yeah, I mean, you know, here you have this national icon artifact, and it's, you know, it's going up to the highest bidder. I mean, it's.
Do you approve of that as an ethical collector?
I think so. I mean, because you're talking about availability of a national icon artifact, and
I had a different perspective on the same object because we bid for it and lost. Can you hear me?
Henry Ford had more money than
you
we
guys.
did.
You guys came down right after us. Actually.
Yeah, we didn't have enough money for it. But one of the things we did, and it would actually support Henry Ford acquiring it as well, is before we became involved in bidding for it at all,
we talked to all the museums that we thought would be more appropriate for it, particularly across the South. We didn't want to get in a situation where we were bidding against a less financially well-off institution, but one that might be more appropriate as the home for it. So as part of our due diligence before we even bid on it, we actually had those conversations with a whole range of museums, civil rights related museums. And then we didn't have the money, so it didn't matter. But there were conversations among bidders with those various institutions before.
I would just offer an opinion as one professional that I think this is a field-wide example of what you yourself, James, have talked about as being the conflict between means and ends within one institution. As a field of museums, we have a responsibility to try and make sure things go in their most logical place where they mean most to the institution to which they would be logically attached. So I disagree with the decision.
I just want to add one more comment there, I think, because from a NAGPRA perspective, the emphasis on ownership of the object and sort of where it ends up might be maybe overemphasized at the expense of museums envisioning new ways of sharing objects. And that maybe it's at the Henry Ford Museum now, but why not some sort of long-term loan?
But I do want to emphasize that we would have stepped out of the bidding process entirely if there had been any indication that there was. It was clear this was going to be sold. And we would have stepped out of it entirely if there had been any indication, any expression of interest by any of those museums, and none of them, they all encouraged us to bid for it. So I think while you may think it was better for it to go there, indeed it wasn't going to go to one of those institutions. It was just going to go somewhere else. And so I actually do feel that we did our best, short of, we don't have the resources to buy it and give it to another museum, and that we don't have, but it was clearly going on at auction. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with an artifact of that caliber, I mean, it's really, I mean, from my own opinion as a conservator, which I really didn't have a chance to weigh in on a lot of those issues, but I mean, my vote would be for the artifact to go to, rather than a small civil rights museum that gets very low attendance, would be to go to an institution like the Smithsonian or like the Henry Ford Museum as maybe another alternative option, because of just the mass appeal. I mean, we get millions of visitors every year from all around the world that have the opportunity to see that artifact. So it's a matter of making that artifact available to more people. So I guess if you take it from that side, it does make more sense to have such a significant artifact at some of the more popular institutions.
I'm Eric Ledbetter from the American Association of Museums, but my question probably comes as much from my own work in museums as Busman's Holiday. I volunteer and serve on the board at a small museum, the Transportation Museum as it happens. Listening to everything this morning and trying to pull it all together in my mind, there's something I'm wrestling with, and I don't know that this is exactly a question. It's maybe more something that I hope we'll all wrestle with. This morning and yesterday evening, I was privileged to hear about this incredible project in the UK, and it gave me a great deal of food for thought. But in looking at it, it occurred to me that a great deal of the value in that approach, but also something perhaps slightly problematic to it, is that it was framed within a humanistic conception, the humanities in terms of telling stories about what it is to be human. And within the realm of constructing identity, constructing narratives about human beings, we do have a lot of opportunity to problematize things, to pose new questions, to pose questions rather than impose narratives and challenge visitors that way. But we have other kinds of museums that exist to serve certain domains of knowledge. I'm thinking particular in science, where as a science museum, you are to represent a certain way of knowing about the world. And that way of knowing imposes on you ethical constraints about what you can and cannot endorse. All roads are not equally good from a certain perspective. A science museum is going to have to, at the end of the day, say that data points one way once the consensus is achieved. So I'm interested in what happens when an ethical rhetoric that we're using a lot today that proposes the museum as agent of social change, that's a humanistic rhetoric, comes with other domains in which we as museums work, domains that make claims of some kind of technical authority. And Malcolm, it comes up in yours and my work, thinking about this morning's presentation. Do I operate a historic trolley car? I suddenly found myself thinking something else entirely. I can't make that trolley car accessible without profoundly altering its fabric. But if I don't make it accessible by operating it today, I will be literally perpetuating and enacting, as some of my visitors struggle up the stairs, an experience of discrimination. Is my ethical obligation now to argue for not operating because encoded in that technology are old social assumptions that will be inflicted on real 21st century fellow citizens? So these are the sorts of things I'm wrestling with. And again, I don't know that that's a question so much as a cry from the heart.
Well, I certainly don't have an answer for that one. But I mean, I think a similar issue came up, I mean, going back to the Rosa Parks bus. The financial resources that it took to bring that artifact into even basic exhibitable condition were significant. We spent just as much money on the acquisition as we did on the restoration. But all the decision making that went into, how far do we restore it? Do we preserve it as is, as it was found? Do we make the interior accessible for visitors? Do we leave it as this unaltered relic? All of these decisions were made internally within the museum. That was one of the conflicts that I brought up at the time was, who really owns this artifact? I mean, the museum legally owned it because we bought it. But whose story is it? It's as a middle-aged Caucasian male, it's not my story. So should I have a voice in how it should be restored or how it should be interpreted? And I think the museum could have done greater efforts at outreaching to other organizations and groups to chime in on those decisions. But we did end up fully restoring the bus. We did the most conservative restoration as possible, saving original pieces of plywood that were rotted, all sorts of stuff. That another museum or organization that didn't have a conservator on staff would have taken a much more traditional approach to restoration, where things are completely stripped. Anything that has a shred of corrosion or rot in it would be replaced. And so the artifact is left even more compromised and less of an authentic, original historic artifact. But the bus is acceptable, or is open for visitors to go in and sit down, and it really is an amazingly powerful experience to see people go in there and sit down in the seat where she was arrested, and just see the emotional responses you get. So to answer your question about your trolley car, there's so many different factors that go into making that decision. It's hard to make the call.